Thank you, Peter, and I would like to thank the organizers for bringing me here. It's really a pleasure to be here today with you. Maybe I should open with two warnings. A, I'm an Israeli, therefore I'm not going to be politically correct. B, I do not represent any Israeli official position. I hardly represent myself. So, I'm a scholar, and I'm a counterterrorism expert. And if any of you think about second career, I would recommend consider becoming an academic. First of all, because you have a sabbatical year. Every few years you get a sabbatical year, full salary, you can take the time and think and research and write. And I spent my sabbatical year 3 years ago in the United States. I was teaching at Stanford and UC Berkeley. And it was a very interesting time because this was the election year when President Obama won the election. And immediately after President Obama won the election, after a few weeks, he traveled to Cairo, from all places, to Cairo. And he decided that he will give his Cairo speech. The Cairo speech set forth the new American foreign policy in reference to the Muslim world, in reference to the relations between the United States and the Muslim world altogether. And a few hours after the speech, I was interviewed by one of the TV channels in the area there. And the TV asked me, or the crew asked me, the first question is, what is the reaction in Israel to the Cairo speech? And I said, look, I now temporarily live in the Bay Area. I do not represent Israel, so I cannot tell you what Israel think about it, but I'm an Israeli. And when you ask a question in Israeli, even if he doesn't know the answer, he gives you an answer. So I think that in Israel we have mixed feelings towards the speech in Cairo. He asked me, can you elaborate on that? I said, of course, it's a combination of hope and concern. Concern because we think that, or I at least think that the buzzwords that were used there and the slogans that were used in this Cairo speech were reflecting a simplistic way of seeing the complicated problem that we all face today, the problem of Islamic radicalism, global jihadi terrorism, and so on and so forth. We hope that we are wrong, and actually this is the right step in the right track, and this would lead to a better world, and we will be one of the first benefactors if this would be the case. Then the second question was, and what is the reaction in the Jewish community in the Bay Area to the speech in Cairo? I said, look, I definitely don't represent the Jewish community in the Bay Area, but since you've asked me, I think that the Jewish community in the Bay Area have mixed feelings towards the speech in Cairo, a combination of hope and concern. So the journalist was totally confused, and he said, so what's the difference between the reaction in Israel and the reaction of the Jewish community in the Bay Area? I said, look, in Israel we have much, much more concern and very little hope. Here in the Bay Area there is much more hope and very little concern. I have to say that in a retrospective point of view, my concern today is bigger than it used to be 3 years ago. And it started before the Arab Spring erupted. It started when I heard, about a year and a half, 2 years ago, a public statement of the counterterrorism coordinator. Actually, it's the counterterrorism advisor of the White House of President Obama, Mr. John Brennan. John Brennan was presenting in one of the think tanks in Washington the new American counterterrorism policy. In one of the first statements, he was saying something along the lines, I quote from a memory, terrorism is not our enemy. Mr. John Brennan, you are the advisor of the president for counterterrorism, not the human rights advisor of the president. Where an advisor to the counterterrorism cannot say that terrorism is not our enemy. Yes, I know, you are playing with words. I do it myself, I'm a scholar. How do you play with words? Terrorism is a tactic cannot be an enemy, therefore terrorism is not our enemy. Fine. The second statement was even more troubling in my view. And the second statement was, again, something along the line of Islamists and jihadists are not our enemy. And then I wrote an op-ed immediately after that at the Jerusalem Post, and I wrote there, if Islamists and jihadists are not your enemy, then who's your enemy? And actually I argued there that this message, which is being conveyed to the Muslim world, to the Arab world, is a very dangerous and very confusing message to whom? To the pragmatic Muslims all over the world, because they know that the jihadists and the Islamists are the enemy. I asked the question in my article, what is the message that you are conveying to one of your biggest ally in the world, definitely in the Muslim and the Arab world, to President Mubarak? What should he understand from the message that Islamists and jihadists are not the enemy of the United States, when he knows that his life is on risk on a daily basis from the Islamists and the jihadists? He knows that he's being attacked by those Islamists and jihadists. Why? Because he's an ally of the United States, and now the patron is saying Islamists and jihadists is not our enemy. That's, in my view, represents the embryonic problem that was conveyed by the American administration. Now, how did it happen? Actually, again, as you see, I'm trying to explain this phenomenon of the Arab Spring, what caused the Arab Spring, what are the implications of the Arab Spring from a counterterrorism point of view. If you ask me if I can summarize anything I learned about terrorism into one sentence, I would say that the answer is yes. The answer is positive. I call it the formula of terrorism. The formula of terrorism holds two factors: motivation and operational capability. It means when a certain group of people has motivation to launch terrorist attacks, and they have also the operational capability that allows them to materialize the motivation, then a terrorist attack or a terrorist campaign would occur. That's the formula of terrorism. That's true everywhere around the world. From the formula of terrorism, we can conclude, therefore, what is the formula of counterterrorism? Very simple, the same formula. To be effective in counterterrorism, you have to deal with counter-motivation and counter the operational capability of the terrorists. One of the two is not good enough. Maybe it's a temporary solution, but it's not an ultimate solution. The ultimate solution for terrorism is dealing with both factors at the same time. Easier said than done. Because once you are trying to lower down the operational capability of the terrorist, how do you do that? With operative measures. You arrest them, you fight them, you kill them, you destroy their warehouses of weapons and ammunitions. Like it or not, as effective as you are in doing all of the above, you raise their motivation to retaliate. That's the boomerang effect in counterterrorism. Now, when I have this in mind, I'm asking myself, what was the difference? What is the difference between the American counterterrorism policy, the American counterterrorism policy of President Obama, compared to that of President Bush? And I would argue that both of them fully understand the formula of terrorism and the formula of counterterrorism. Both of them did their best in order to counter the motivation and to counter the operational capability. But the difference was, and still is, the emphasis. The emphasis of President Bush was on countering the operational capability of the terrorists. The emphasis of President Obama is dealing with countering the motivation that leads to terrorism. By the way, it's only natural that this will be the difference between the two. Because when you are the president of a nation that suffered an atrocity like 9/11, immediately after that you do whatever you can in order to delude the threat to your citizens. I was in the United States when 9/11 occurred, and I was interviewed there a few hours after the attack. And the first question that was posed to me time and again by the audience, by the viewers, by the listeners that listened to the program was, why the hell don't we nuke them? Excuse me. Who are you going to nuke? Who is they? We didn't know even that was Al-Qaeda at that time, few hours after the attack. Who are you going to nuke? What would be the implication of nuking? They didn't care about that. They just wanted to be safe. And I would say that any president, as liberal as it would be under these circumstances, would immediately do whatever he can in order to delude the threat and therefore be proactive and therefore use all the possible measures and tools that he would have in order to deal with the operational capability of the terrorists. And it's only natural that President Obama shifted the emphasis from operational capability, although he's still doing a lot in that field, but the emphasis is on countering motivation. But the question is, while trying to counter the motivation, Is this the right message that you need to send to the Muslim world, to the Arab world? Islamists and jihadists are not our enemy? Is this counter-motivation, or this is a type of appeasement? And I would say that this is the wrong message. What should have been the right message, at least in my view? With your permission, another anecdote. A few years ago, I was invited to give a talk in Brussels. And when I came to the auditorium, there was another speaker speaking before me. He was a religious cleric, a Muslim religious cleric, an imam coming from Sudan. And he was standing there and he was preaching to the audience, and he was very persuasive, and he said, "How dare you? How dare you refer to Islam as if it is something to do with those atrocities which are being called terrorism, violence, political violence, and so on. So do you know what Islam is altogether? Islam is all about peace and clemency. You are using the term jihadi terrorism. Do you know what jihad is altogether? Jihad is all about doing those good deeds and not those atrocities." It was very persuasive. Then was my turn. And he was still in the room, so I approached him and I said, "My friend, I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I'm sincere in saying that you took the trouble to fly all over the way from Sudan to Brussels to share with us those two important messages." And I said, "I'm not politically correct. I'm not trying to be politically correct. I sincerely mean it. It's important for us to know that those atrocities, those terrorist attacks, this is not Islam. This is a misconception of Islam. That this is not jihad. This is a misunderstanding of what is jihad altogether. But between you and me, my friend, I don't really understand why did you bother to fly all over the way from Sudan to Brussels to share with us those two important messages instead of staying in Sudan or crossing to Yemen or crossing to Somalia or flying to Afghanistan or Pakistan or Yemen or you name it, and tell those people which are beheading innocent civilians under the name of Islam, raising the flag of jihad while they do that, please tell them that what they do is against Islam and against jihadi verdicts." If you have a task in life, is exactly that, because we are now, the whole international community, we are facing a war. We are in the midst of a world war, my friends. Wake up. It's a different world war. It's not like the First and the Second World War. This is a war of ideas or on ideas. This is a religious war. But thanks God, this is not a war between religions. This is a religious war, but it's first and foremost a war within religion, within the religion of Islam. And the only one who can win this war are the Muslims themselves. I cannot win this war, you cannot win this war. It's only for the Muslims to win the war and to gain the control on the holy religion and not let the extremists and the fundamentalists take the control. But if we are going to sweep the dust under the rug and say, no problem, Islam is jihadist, everything is okay, we are not going to see to it that the brave Muslims, the pragmatic brave, and you need to be very brave if you are pragmatic, that they would stand against those, I wouldn't say lunatics that you'll understand in a moment, but very dangerous villains that are conducting those terrorist attacks. This is the background, in my view, to the Arab Spring. And we should understand the Arab Spring on that background. I don't argue, God forbid, that anyone actually is responsible and created the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring is an authentic phenomenon that came out as an outcome of the frustration of the Arab masses living in dictatorships or pseudo-dictatorships or pseudo-democracies, living in a very poor socio-economical conditions and so on and so forth. And this was their immediate reaction. But I would argue that the American foreign policy and the American counterterrorism policy that I described gave the backwind to this process. So you would say, okay, so what? It's a good process. Well, I beg to differ. I think that we in the Western society, in Canada, and especially maybe even in the United States, we are translating that from a wrong point of view. We are having, the Western society, and especially the United States, has a certain type of naivete in reference to that process which is being called the Arab Spring. I mean, even the term Arab Spring is a wrong term. You know, in Israel we call it the Islamic winter, not the Arab Spring. Because the Americans have, in my view, in my humble view, have two misunderstandings or two naive cultural beliefs. The first one is that democracy is a miracle solution to radicalism, to extremism, to violence, and to terrorism. That's the first mistake. The second mistake is the belief that elections, free elections, this is democracy. My friends, I would like to argue that democracy is much, much bigger phenomenon than free election. Free election is one important apparatus of democracy, but democracy is a set of values, is a combination of civil liberties, of civil society, of human rights, of respect for the rights of minority, of women lib. This is what democracy is all about. Liberalism. And yes, in democracy it's very important to have this tool of free election. But when you have only the tool of free election without all of those values, then you might find yourself in a very dangerous situation in which fundamentalists take over the country. And that's what we are facing right now. And when fundamentalists are taking over the country in a democratic process, it's a one man, one vote, one time. Because after that, you don't have free elections. You might have elections, but this is a camouflage. And we see it in different countries today. So I would like to argue that the process, you know, it's still in the midst of the process. I agree. We don't know where it's leading. Actually, we do know where it's leading. Because we have at least two examples. One less problematic and the other one very problematic, Tunisia and Egypt. And it's leading to one political end in which the Islamists are taking over those countries. It could be less problematic Islamists like Muslim Brotherhood, we'll speak about that in a moment, or the Salafists. And President Obama was saying less than a year ago, just before the election, the first election in Egypt, and where everybody was worried that the Muslim Brotherhood will win the election, he said, I think that the Muslim Brotherhood is one fraction in Egypt. They don't have majority support in Egypt. No, they don't. They won, together with the Salafists, 67% of the voters. And that's the process that is going to happen. In other countries, we are in the midst of the process. Syria is on the way. Who knows what will be after the fall of Assad in other countries. So what is the implications that we have already, that we can understand from the outcome of the Arab Spring? I would divide them into two implications, short-term implications and long-term implications. The short-term implications, we already witnessed them. First of all, we see that states that was under the control of this or the other regime, more democratic, less democratic, we have a problem with this regime or the other regime. Yes, we do. But it was a state that had its own statehood, and they controlled their own territory. Today, we see that the new governments, at least in Egypt, definitely in Yemen, Libya, are failed states. They are leading to something which is becoming a failure in the statehood of the state. Furthermore, we see territories that are becoming ungoverned territories. Libya, Yemen, Sinai Peninsula. This is a totally ungoverned territory. And you know what? When you have failed statehood and ungoverned territories, this is a recipe for global jihadi terrorism, infiltration. This is a recipe of a heaven for those terrorists. And that's exactly what we are seeing right now. We see it in the Arab, we see it in Sinai. We see it in Libya, we see it in Yemen, and other places altogether. So that's the first short term, where those global and local jihadi elements are being rooted in those countries. Furthermore, still in the short term, weapons. Many experts in the world is very worried today about what happened with the weapons warehouses of the Libyan army. It evaporated. Nobody knows where the weapon is. Actually, now we start to understand where the weapon is. The weapon fell into the wrong hands. And we see this weapon, sophisticated weapon, pop up in different conflict areas, in Africa, in Nigeria, in Niger, in the Middle East, in Sinai, in Gaza. And we'll see it all over the world because it's going from hand to hand and it's being sold in the black market. And these weapons is going to fuel the terrorist activity around the world. But this is only the short term. What about the long term? I wouldn't argue that this is deterministic, what I'm saying right now, but it's more probable. I said already that we see the trend, and the trend is the different variation of the Muslim Brotherhood taking over those countries, using or misusing the democratic process. Those Muslim Brotherhood, you know, you have different interpretation and variation of them. We even heard some American prominent leader that says they are not even religious. Don't be worried about them. Well, they are religious. They didn't change their views. And they have the ultimate goal. By the way, that the Salafist has the same ultimate goal. And the jihadist and the terrorist has the same ultimate goal, which is spreading their version of Islam and creating caliphate state all over the world. The difference between the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda, for that matter, one of the biggest differences, is that the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't call for the use of violence, doesn't call for terrorism, but the ideology or the ultimate goal is the same ultimate goal. Now, what will happen after they will stabilize their new governments? No doubt that they will emphasize and they would be focused in harnessing some of the resources of their states into what? Into the dawah activity, into the ideological, religious services, welfare, and all those things that are helpful in buying hearts and minds of the masses. They do it way before they took the control on those countries. But now they have the ability to harness those resources to do the same thing that they used to do before, but with much more power, much more resources, and much more capabilities. So you will have much more people that will be exposed to those ideological ideas. Again, without the call for terrorism and violence. Seems to be okay. But what we know, that some people, minority, learn from those ideas that there is a need to take a gun and to use violence in order to promote the same goals. They have different views from the Muslim Brotherhood, but they take the Muslim Brotherhood ideology in order to create splinters group, much more dogmatic, much more terroristic. Who's Hamas? Hamas is the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood by definition. Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda, the one who replaced bin Laden, he has a lot of different views than the Muslim Brotherhood. They have a lot of debates between them. But he used to be a Muslim Brotherhood activist. He is an Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. He got his early education in the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So the Muslim Brotherhood gave birth to those extremists, intentionally or unintentionally, but that's what happened. So for the long term, I would say that we would see that this process would lead into the birth of splinter groups, of terrorist organizations, which will be even more problematic than Al-Qaeda. To sum this up, I would like to say that we are living in a very challenging time. This is tectonic changes, not less than that. And I didn't speak yet about Iran. Probably will have the time to speak about it during the Q&A. I don't want to take too much time of yours. But if you ask me what is the biggest challenge of the Western society, of the whole world today, is to call a spade, is not to hide behind political correctness, because nothing good will come out of it. We need to stand firm against those radicals and against those extremists. And we need to define, and we need to find out, and we need to support the pragmatics. And we need to have a very clear message to the Muslim world, to the whole world. It's your problem. It's an internal problem in Islam. We are here to help you in anything we can. Thank you very much.